"You're in the wrong seat, little girl, and I'm going to need you to move right now." Those words would echo through boardrooms and courtrooms for months to come. But at 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, 8-year-old Zara Williams was just excited about her first trip to San Francisco. She bounced on her toes beside her mother, Keisha, clutching a worn sketchbook against her chest like a shield made of dreams and colored pencils. The airport buzzed with early morning energy travelers dragging wheeled suitcases across polished floors, while announcement voices echoed from invisible speakers overhead. Keisha Williams adjusted her blazer and checked her boarding pass one more time, not because she needed to, but because she'd learned that being prepared was the best defense against the kind of assumptions people made about a 35-year-old black woman traveling first class with her daughter. "Mama, can I draw the airplane when we get on?" Zara asked, opening her sketchbook to show pages filled with careful drawings of their family, their house, their cat, Mr. Whiskers sitting in a patch of sunlight. Each picture was signed in purple crayon with her full name, because Zara Williams was proud of every single thing she created. Of course, baby Keisha said, smoothing one of Zara's carefully braided pigtails, "You can draw everything you see today, and we'll show Daddy when we get there." The mention of her father made Zara's eyes light up even brighter, if that was possible, because Damon Williams had promised to take her to see the Golden Gate Bridge and maybe even Alcatraz if she was brave enough for the boat ride. What Zara didn't know, what no 8-year-old should have to know, was that her father was one of the most powerful venture capital partners on the West Coast, that his infrastructure fund controlled $12 billion in development money, and that in less than 48 hours, he was scheduled to sign the largest airport modernization deal in American history with Pacific Airways. She only knew that Daddy gave the best hugs and always remembered to pack her favorite strawberry fruit snacks. Keisha guided them through the first-class boarding line, watching other passengers with the careful awareness that came from years of navigating spaces where people questioned your right to belong. A businessman in an expensive suit glanced at them briefly, then back to his phone. An elderly woman with pearls smiled at Zara's animated chatter about seeing clouds from above. Normal interactions, the kind that happened thousands of times every day in airports across the country. They settled into seats 2A and 2B. Zara pressing her face against the window to watch ground crew loading luggage, while Keisha organized their carry-on items with practiced efficiency. The cabin filled slowly around them, first-class passengers claiming their spacious seats and overhead bin space with the casual entitlement that came with premium ticket prices. Flight attendants prepare for boarding came the announcement, and Keisha felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always came before potential confrontation, the involuntary preparation for having to prove they belonged exactly where they were. Brittany Hayes had worked for Pacific Airways for 18 years, climbing from domestic coach routes to international first class through a combination of seniority determination and an unwavering belief that maintaining cabin standards was both her right and her responsibility. At 45, with platinum blonde hair pulled into a regulation bun and a smile that could shift from warm to Arctic in seconds, she commanded her domain with the authority of someone who had seen every type of passenger and knew exactly how to handle each situation. She performed her pre-flight inspection with military precision, checking overhead bins, counting safety equipment, and scanning passenger faces for potential problems. Row 1, businessman with laptop already open, no issues there. Row 2, elderly woman with a book, settled and quiet. Row 3, and Brittany's trained eye caught something that made her pause. A black woman, mid-30s, designer blazer, sitting with a child who couldn't be more than 8 or 9. The little girl was coloring in what looked like a sketchbook, completely absorbed in her work, occasionally looking up to say something to her mother with the kind of animated enthusiasm that usually meant noise and disruption during flight service. Brittany had developed instincts about passengers over nearly 2 decades in the air, and something about this particular family set off the subtle alarm bells that experienced flight attendants learned to trust. Not anything she could put her finger on exactly, just a sense that they might require more management than the typical first-class passengers who understood the unspoken rules of premium cabin behavior. "Good morning," she said, approaching their row with her professional smile in place. "I'll need to see your boarding passes, please." The request came out smoothly automatically, the kind of routine verification that happened hundreds of times per flight. Keisha looked up from her phone and handed over both boarding passes without comment. But Brittany caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of shoulders that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had questioned their presence in first class. The passes were legitimate, of course. Seat 2A and 2B purchased 3 weeks ago, according to the booking information that appeared when Brittany scanned them. But legitimacy wasn't always the whole story, and Brittany had learned to pay attention to details that other crew members might miss. Designer clothes didn't necessarily mean designer income, and children in first class often meant someone was trying to impress or compensate for something. "Thank you, Brittany," said, handing the passes back with another smile. "We'll be taking off shortly, so I'll need the tray tables up and all personal items stowed during taxi." She gestured toward Zara's sketchbook with the kind of gentle authority that parents usually appreciated when someone else was helping manage their children. Of course, Keisha replied, helping Zara close the sketchbook and tuck her pencils into the seat pocket. "Say thank you to the nice lady, Zara." "Thank you," Zara said obediently, looking up at Brittany with the kind of direct, unguarded eye contact that children specialized in. "Are you going to bring us snacks later? I like the little cookies if you have them." Brittany's smile stayed perfectly in place, but something flickered behind her eyes at the casual assumption that, of course, snacks would be provided. Of course, cookies would be available. Of course, this child expected the same level of service as every other first-class passenger. "We'll see what we have available," she replied. Which wasn't exactly a no, but wasn't exactly a yes either. As boarding continued and the cabin filled to capacity, Brittany found herself glancing back at row 3 more often than necessary, watching the interaction between mother and daughter with the kind of professional attention she usually reserved for passengers who'd already caused problems. The little girl was well-behaved enough quietly drawing while her mother worked on a laptop, but there was something about their easy comfort in the space that bothered Brittany in a way she couldn't quite articulate. 20 minutes after takeoff, with the seatbelt sign dark and the cabin settling into the familiar rhythm of flight service, Brittany began her first-class beverage round with the methodical efficiency that had earned her performance bonuses for 3 consecutive years. She prided herself on reading passengers quickly and providing exactly the level of service each person expected from the businessman who wanted his scotch neat, and his conversation minimal to the nervous flyers who needed extra attention and reassurance. Row 1 got coffee black served with a warm smile and a gentle reminder that breakfast service would begin in 30 minutes. Row 2 received herbal tea and a small pillow for the elderly woman's lower back, along with a brief conversation about her visit to see grandchildren in California. Row 3. Brittany simply walked past her service cart, rolling smoothly toward row 4, where a young couple was celebrating their anniversary with champagne. Zara looked up from her drawing as the cart passed, then looked at her mother with the confused expression children get when the world doesn't behave the way they expect it to. "Mama," she whispered. "Did she forget about us?" Keisha had been expecting. This had been preparing for it since the moment Brittany first approached their seats, with that particular combination of professional courtesy and subtle suspicion that she'd encountered in hotel lobbies and restaurant hostess stands and rental car counters across the country. "She'll come back," baby Keisha said quietly. "Just keep drawing." But Brittany didn't come back, not even after she'd served every other passenger in the first-class cabin and parked her cart in the galley area. 30 minutes passed, then 45, while Zara's thirst grew and her confusion deepened into the kind of patient disappointment that children develop when adults fail to keep implicit promises. "Mama, I'm really thirsty. Zara finally said loud enough that the elderly woman in row 2 turned to look at them with a frown of concern. "Can you ask the lady for some water?" Before Keisha could respond, Zara had unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up with the direct problem-solving approach that 8-year-olds specialized in. If the flight attendant wasn't coming to them, she would go to the flight attendant because asking for water when you were thirsty was such a basic request that surely no adult would refuse it. She walked up the aisle toward the galley area, her sketchbook tucked under her arm the way she always carried it past the businessman, who glanced up from his laptop with mild curiosity, past the elderly woman who watched with growing alarm as the situation developed. At the galley entrance, Zara stopped and peered around the curtain where Brittany was organizing service items with deliberate precision. "Excuse me, ma'am," Zara said in the polite voice her parents had taught her to use with adults. "Could I please have some water? I asked my mama to ask you, but she said I could ask you myself." The request was simple, direct, and delivered with the kind of innocent courtesy that usually melted adult resistance. But Brittany turned around with an expression that had nothing warm or accommodating in it, looking down at Zara with the full weight of 18 years of authority and the growing frustration of dealing with passengers who didn't understand boundaries. "Little girl, you cannot be back here," she said sharply. "This is a restricted area and passengers are not allowed in the galley under any circumstances." "I just wanted water," Zara said, taking a small step backward as the flight attendant's tone registered as something much harsher than she'd expected. "I'm really thirsty, and you didn't come to our seats when you gave everyone else drinks." "You need to return to your seat immediately," Brittany continued, her voice rising enough that passengers in nearby rows could hear every word. "I don't know what kind of service you're used to, but on this aircraft, children don't wander around making demands." Zara's bottom lip began to tremble, but she didn't cry, didn't run, didn't do anything except stand there, trying to understand why asking for water had turned into something that felt like being in trouble. "I wasn't making demands," she said quietly. "I said please." That's when Brittany reached out and grabbed her arm, not gently, not the way you guide a confused child back to safety, but with the kind of firm grip that leaves Mark's fingers pressing into soft skin with enough force to make Zara gasp and drop her sketchbook. Pencils scattered across the galley floor, rolling under service carts and into corners, while the carefully drawn pictures of her family fluttered open to a page that would later bear a permanent crease right through the middle of her father's smiling face. "When I tell you to do something, you do it," Brittany said through gritted teeth, her grip tightening as she pulled Zara toward the aisle. "You don't argue, you don't make excuses, and you certainly don't wander around this aircraft like you own it." The sound that came out of Zara's throat wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a word, just a small broken note of pain and confusion that cut through the cabin noise like a blade through silence. It was the sound of a child who'd never been grabbed by a stranger, who'd never been spoken to with such barely controlled anger, who couldn't understand what she'd done wrong beyond being thirsty and asking for help. The first-class cabin erupted into chaos as Keisha shot out of her seat with the reflexive speed of a mother whose child had just cried out in pain. "Get your hands off my daughter!" she shouted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made every passenger within 3 rows turn to stare at the confrontation unfolding near the galley. But it was Eleanor Crawford who moved first, the 68-year-old retired civil rights lawyer who'd spent 40 years fighting battles in courtrooms and had developed an instinct for recognizing injustice when she saw it happening in real time. Despite arthritis in both knees and a hip replacement that made quick movements painful, Eleanor pushed herself out of her seat and stood in the aisle with the kind of dignified fury that had once faced down segregationist judges and hostile juries. "Release that child immediately," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What you're doing is assault, and there are 30 witnesses in this cabin who are watching you commit it." Brittany looked around the cabin for the first time and saw what Eleanor had already observed. Nearly every passenger had their phone out. cameras recording faces showing various degrees of shock and outrage at watching a uniformed airline employee physically restrain an 8-year-old girl who'd committed no crime beyond asking for water. The businessman in row 1 was recording from multiple angles the anniversary couple had stopped celebrating to document what they were witnessing, and even the flight crew members emerging from the cockpit had their hands on their own phones. This child was in a restricted area, Brittany said defensively, but her grip on Zara's arm loosened slightly as she began to realize that her authority might not be as unquestioned as she'd assumed. I was enforcing safety protocols that exist for the protection of all passengers. Safety protocols, Eleanor repeated, stepping closer with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent decades dismantling weak arguments in public forums. Safety protocols that require grabbing an 8-year-old hard enough to leave bruises. Safety protocols that justify refusing service to paying passengers. Safety protocols that somehow only seem to apply to certain families. Keisha reached her daughter at the same moment. Brittany finally released her grip, and Zara immediately buried her face against her mother's shoulder while Keisha's hands moved over her arms and back, checking for injuries with the kind of frantic thoroughness that parents reserve for moments of genuine fear. The red marks on Zara's upper arm were already darkening into the finger-shaped bruises that would later become evidence in congressional hearings and federal investigations. Mama Zara whispered against Keisha's neck, "I just wanted water. Why is she so mad at me?" The question hung in the cabin air like an indictment, simple and devastating in its innocence, because everyone listening knew exactly why a black child asking for water had somehow become a threat requiring physical force. The recording phones captured not just the incident, but the aftermath, the way other passengers looked away in uncomfortable recognition, the way Brittany's face cycled through justification and dawning awareness of what dozens of cameras had just documented. Captain James Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit with the grim expression of someone who'd spent 15 years managing in-flight crises and could immediately assess the difference between a simple service dispute and a career-ending catastrophe. He took in the scene with professional efficiency, scattered pencils on the galley floor. A crying child with visible marks on her arm. A mother trembling with barely controlled rage. An elderly woman standing in righteous fury, and a flight attendant whose face had gone pale with the realization that her 18-year career might have just ended in the time it took to grab a child's arm. "Ma'am," he said to Brittany, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that cut through tension like a knife. "Step away from the passengers and report to the rear galley immediately." Then he knelt down to Zara's level, making himself small and non-threatening in the way good people do when children are frightened. "I'm Captain Rodriguez," he said gently. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Zara looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, still clutching her mother's hand, but no longer actively crying. "She grabbed my arm really hard," she said in a voice so small it barely carried beyond the front rows, "and she yelled at me for asking for water. I didn't do anything wrong, did I?" "No, sweetheart," Captain Rodriguez said firmly. "You didn't do anything wrong, and I'm going to make sure this gets fixed, okay?" He stood up and addressed the entire first-class cabin with the kind of formal announcement that passengers knew meant serious business. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disturbance. We're going to handle this situation appropriately, and I want to assure everyone that the safety and comfort of all passengers is our highest priority." But even as he spoke the words, Captain Rodriguez knew that traditional airline crisis management wouldn't be sufficient for what had just happened, because 30 passengers with phones had recorded something that couldn't be spun or managed or quietly resolved with vouchers and confidential settlements. They'd recorded a uniformed authority figure attacking a child, and in less than 6 hours the entire world would be watching. 3,000 miles away in San Francisco, Damon Williams stood in the private terminal at SFO with a bouquet of yellow sunflowers in one hand and a packet of strawberry fruit snacks in his jacket pocket, checking his watch and smiling at the thought of seeing his daughter's face when she walked off the jetway. He'd left his morning board meeting early, specifically to be here for their arrival, because missing moments with Zara was something he'd learned never to do after too many business trips had taken him away from bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. His phone buzzed with a text from Keisha that contained just 2 words: "Call immediately." The flowers dropped to his side as he dialed, and Keisha answered before the first ring finished. She didn't speak right away, and Damon heard everything in that silence, the kind of loaded quiet that preceded life-changing conversations and emergency room visits and all the phone calls parents dread receiving. "Talk to me," he said, already moving toward a private corner of the terminal where he could have whatever conversation was coming without being overheard by other travelers. Keisha told him everything in a voice that stayed steady through sheer force of will because Zara was sitting right beside her, and children shouldn't have to watch their mothers break down in public, not even after watching their mothers defend them against uniformed authority figures who grabbed little girls hard enough to leave marks. She told him about Brittany Hayes and the refused service and the walk to the galley, and the moment when everything changed from discrimination to assault. "Is she hurt?" Damon asked, his grip tightening on the phone until his knuckles went white. "She has bruises on her arm. 4 finger marks. And she keeps asking me why that woman was so angry at her for being thirsty." Keisha's voice finally cracked on the last word, the composed executive facade giving way to the raw emotion of a mother who'd watched her child be attacked by someone in a position of trust. "What did you tell her? I told her some people are broken in places you can't see, but that doesn't make it her fault." Keisha took a shaky breath. "Damon, there were cameras everywhere. This is going to be huge." Damon closed his eyes and leaned against the terminal wall, processing the information with the kind of systematic thinking that had made him one of the most successful venture capital partners on the West Coast, but also feeling the white-hot rage that came from knowing his 8-year-old daughter had been hurt by a stranger, and he wasn't there to protect her. "I'll meet you at the gate," he said finally. "Tell Zara that Daddy has her fruit snacks and we're going to fix this." But even as he said it, Damon was already 3 steps ahead because $12 billion in infrastructure funding gave him leverage that most parents in his situation would never have. And Pacific Airways had just made the most expensive mistake in aviation history by allowing one of their employees to put her hands on the daughter of someone who could pull their entire expansion plan with a single phone call. He hung up and immediately dialed his chief counsel, a woman named Sophia Martinez, who'd been by his side through hostile takeovers and regulatory battles and deals that would have collapsed under lesser legal minds. She answered on the second ring, and he could hear the sounds of her own children in the background, the normal chaos of family dinner that he'd been looking forward to sharing with his own family. "Sophia, I need you to pull the Pacific Airways partnership file and call an emergency meeting tonight. Someone hurt Zara." The background noise stopped immediately. What happened? Flight attendant assaulted her, physically grabbed her arm, left bruises, multiple witnesses, video evidence. Damon's voice was completely calm, which Sophia had learned over 5 years of working together was more dangerous than any amount of shouting. "I want every option on the table, legal and financial. I'll have the files ready within an hour," Sophia said. "And Damon, whatever you're about to do, make sure it matters." By 8 p.m. Pacific time, Damon's downtown San Francisco office looked like a war room with legal documents spread across the conference table, laptops displaying real-time social media feeds, and 3 of his most trusted advisors working with the focused intensity of people who understood that the next few hours would determine whether Pacific Airways survived as a company. Sophia Martinez had the partnership contracts laid out like a roadmap to financial destruction. 400 pages of terms and conditions that represented 18 months of negotiation and due diligence on the largest infrastructure deal in American aviation history. Across from her, David Park, Damon's chief financial officer, ran calculations on multiple screens while monitoring Pacific Airways' stock price, which had already begun declining in after-hours trading as early reports of the incident started circulating on aviation industry blogs. The third person in the room was someone Pacific Airways executives had never heard of, but would soon learn to fear Dr. Elena Vasquez, a data forensics specialist whose company had developed the bias detection algorithms that could have prevented what happened to Zara if Pacific Airways had been interested in actually addressing discrimination rather than just appearing to address it. "How bad is the video?" Damon asked, though he'd already watched it 3 times and knew exactly how bad it was. 12 million views in 6 hours, Sophia replied, pulling up analytics on her tablet. CNN picked it up an hour ago. The NAACP issued a statement 20 minutes ago. 3 congressional offices have already called asking for our comment, which suggests they think we're going to make a public response. Damon looked at the freeze-frame image on the conference room screen. Brittany Hayes' hand wrapped around his daughter's arm. Zara's face showing confusion and pain. The scattered pencils and sketchbook pages that represented his little girl's artwork, torn and discarded on a galley floor because she'd committed the unforgivable crime of asking for water. "What are our options with the partnership?" he asked David. "Clean withdrawal under the material adverse change clause." David replied without looking up from his spreadsheets. "If Pacific Airways' public conduct creates reputational risk for our fund, we can pull out without penalty. Based on current stock movement and the viral nature of this incident, we have grounds. Financial impact. On them, catastrophic. The airport modernization project in 6 cities is entirely dependent on our $12 billion in infrastructure funding. Without us, they can't expand terminals in Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, Dallas, Phoenix, or here in San Francisco. Their competitive position in domestic markets collapses overnight." David's fingers moved across his calculator with practiced precision. "Stock price impact starts with our withdrawal announcement. But if other institutional investors follow our lead, total market cap loss could exceed $15 billion in the first week." Elena looked up from her own laptop where she'd been analyzing 3 years of passenger complaint data that Pacific Airways probably didn't know she could access. "It gets worse," she said. "This wasn't an isolated incident. Brittany Hayes has 17 formal complaints filed against her for discriminatory behavior, all involving passengers of color, all resolved with vouchers and confidentiality agreements. The airline has been covering up a pattern." "How do you know that?" Sophia asked. "Because I have access to the same databases that would have flagged this behavior if Pacific Airways had implemented our bias detection software instead of buying the cheapest option available." Elena's tone carried the controlled anger of someone who'd built tools specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of incident. They knew they had a problem. They chose to manage it instead of fixing it. Damon walked to the window overlooking the San Francisco Bay where lights reflected off the water like scattered stars, and the normal world continued its normal business, unaware that a little girl asking for water was about to reshape an entire industry. When he turned back to his team, his face carried the expression that corporate adversaries had learned to recognize as the moment negotiation ended and consequences began. "Draft the withdrawal letter," he said. "I want it on Pacific Airways' General Counsel's desk at 9 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. And I want 3 conditions for reinstatement, independent civil rights audit, mandatory bias training overhaul, and community oversight board with real authority to discipline employees." "Timeline?" Sophia asked. 60 days. "Not because I'm generous, but because real change takes time. And I want change, not just promises." Damon picked up his phone to check messages from Keisha, photos of Zara drawing in their hotel room, trying to rebuild the family picture that had been damaged when her sketchbook fell. One more thing. At the bottom of the withdrawal letter below, all the legal language, add 1 line. What line? She only asked for water. At Pacific Airways headquarters in Seattle, CEO Robert Sterling's Tuesday evening had begun with a routine review of quarterly performance metrics and ended with an emergency board meeting that would determine whether his company still existed by Friday. The call from his crisis management team had come at 9:47 p.m., just as he was reviewing tomorrow's schedule with his assistant, and the words viral video and child assault and $12 billion partnership had turned his comfortable executive routine into a nightmare of legal exposure and financial catastrophe. The video was everywhere by 10 p.m., shared across every social media platform, picked up by major news networks, analyzed by legal experts who used phrases like clear assault and federal civil rights violation and corporate liability. Sterling watched it on his office computer, then watched it again, then called his general counsel and told him to get to headquarters immediately because they were facing something that went far beyond traditional crisis management. "How bad is our exposure?" Sterling asked Thomas Brightwell, the airline's chief legal officer, who'd arrived at headquarters looking like he'd been pulled from his daughter's high school graduation dinner, which he had been, legally or financially. Both. Legally, we're looking at potential federal civil rights violations, assault charges against the employee, and civil liability for inadequate training and supervision. The fact that we have 17 previous complaints against this specific employee that were resolved quietly is going to be problematic if this goes to court. Thomas had spent the drive to headquarters reviewing Brittany Hayes' personnel file and discovering a pattern of behavior that should have resulted in termination years ago. And financially, that depends on Damon Williams. Thomas pulled up news articles about the Williams Infrastructure Fund and its upcoming partnership with Pacific Airways, deals that had taken 18 months to negotiate and represented the largest investment in airport modernization in company history. If he pulls the funding, we're looking at immediate stock price collapse, project cancellations across 6 major cities, and probably job losses in the thousands. Sterling stared at the financial projections on his screen numbers that represented not just corporate profits, but employee livelihoods, pension funds, and communities that depended on Pacific Airways for economic stability. "Has anyone tried to reach Williams?" His office declined our calls. His legal team issued a statement that all communications should go through formal channels until further notice. Thomas scrolled through his phone messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Robert, I think we need to prepare for the worst-case scenario, which is total partnership withdrawal, federal investigation, congressional hearings, and civil lawsuits that could cost us more than the partnership itself." Thomas had seen corporate crises before, but nothing approaching the scope of what Pacific Airways was facing. One 8-minute video has the potential to destroy everything we've built. The irony wasn't lost on Sterling that a company built on moving people safely through the air was being brought down by one employee who couldn't safely manage an interaction with a child. But irony wouldn't help him explain to 30,000 employees why their jobs were disappearing, because someone couldn't bring water to a thirsty little girl. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp California sunshine that usually made Damon Williams grateful to live in the Bay Area. But today he barely noticed the weather as he walked into the downtown press room where 40 reporters, 12 camera crews, and representatives from every major news network waited to hear how $12 billion could vanish because a flight attendant grabbed a child's arm. The prepared statement in his pocket was 2 pages long, but Damon had decided during the drive downtown that formal language wouldn't adequately convey the rage and disappointment and absolute determination that came from watching his daughter ask why a stranger had been so angry at her for being thirsty. This required something more personal, more direct, the kind of plain speaking that cut through corporate doublespeak and political maneuvering. He walked to the podium without notes, looked directly into the cameras, and began speaking in the voice of a father whose child had been hurt by someone in a position of authority. "Yesterday afternoon, my 8-year-old daughter Zara asked a Pacific Airways flight attendant for a glass of water. The flight attendant's response was to grab my daughter's arm hard enough to leave bruises and tell her that she was acting like she owned the aircraft." Damon's voice carried clearly through the press room, calm and controlled, but carrying an edge that suggested barely contained anger. "For asking for water, my daughter was physically assaulted by an employee of an airline that I was prepared to invest $12 billion in modernizing." The reporters leaned forward, sensing that this wasn't going to be a typical corporate statement filled with legal qualifiers and diplomatic language. This was something rarer and more dangerous, a powerful man speaking as a parent whose child had been wronged. This morning, the Williams Infrastructure Fund formally withdrew from our partnership with Pacific Airways. $12 billion that was going to modernize airports in 6 American cities, create 40,000 jobs, and reshape domestic aviation for the next decade. Damon paused, letting the financial magnitude settle into the room. That money is now unavailable to Pacific Airways, effective immediately. The murmur that rippled through the press room was audible reporters already calculating the market impact and reaching for phones to alert their financial desks that Pacific Airways stock was about to crater harder than any airline stock since the pandemic. "I want to be absolutely clear about why this is happening," Damon continued. "This isn't about one flight attendant who made a bad decision. This is about a company culture that allowed 17 formal complaints about discriminatory behavior to be buried with vouchers and silence. This is about an airline that chose to manage racism instead of preventing it." He pulled a single sheet of paper from his jacket pocket, unfolded it carefully, and read from it directly. "The Williams Infrastructure Fund will consider reinstating this partnership if Pacific Airways meets 3 conditions within 60 days. First, an independent civil rights audit conducted by external experts with complete access to employee records and complaint files. Second, mandatory bias training for every employee who interacts with passengers, developed in consultation with civil rights organizations and subject to annual review. Third, the creation of a passenger advocacy board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action." The press room erupted with shouted questions about timelines and financial impacts and whether other airlines might face similar scrutiny, but Damon held up a hand for silence and delivered the line that would be quoted in every news story and congressional hearing for months to come. "My daughter is 8 years old. She weighs 63 pounds. She was carrying a sketchbook and some colored pencils. The only threat she posed to anyone was the threat of being thirsty." He folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. "If Pacific Airways can't handle that level of threat without resorting to physical force, then they don't deserve to handle the infrastructure that moves millions of passengers every year." He walked away from the podium without taking questions, leaving reporters to process the most expensive corporate ultimatum in aviation history, driven not by market forces or regulatory pressure, but by a father who'd watched his daughter be grabbed by someone who was supposed to keep her safe. The video reached 50 million views by Thursday morning, but it was Eleanor Crawford's appearance on CNN that transformed a viral incident into a national conversation about dignity authority and the particular way that racism manifested in spaces where white authority figures made snap judgments about black children who'd committed no crime beyond existing in premium spaces. Eleanor sat across from anchor Anderson Cooper with the same dignified composure she'd shown in the airplane aisle. Her gray hair perfectly styled and her voice carrying 4 decades of courtroom experience as she described exactly what she'd witnessed in the first-class cabin of Flight 2847. "I watched a woman in uniform look at an 8-year-old black child and decide that she was a problem that needed to be managed," Eleanor said, her words precise and devastating. "Not because of anything the child had done, but because of assumptions about where black children belong and how they should behave when they find themselves in spaces that weren't designed with them in mind." Cooper leaned forward with the intensity that had made him one of the most respected interviewers on television. "You've spent your career fighting civil rights cases. How does this incident compare to other forms of discrimination you've encountered?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the careful precision of someone who understood that her words would be replayed and analyzed and quoted in congressional hearings for months to come. "In some ways, it's more insidious than the overt racism I fought in the 70s and 80s, she said finally. Back then, discriminatory intent was explicit. Signs that said where black people couldn't sit, policies that openly excluded us from certain opportunities. This is more subtle, hidden behind policies about passenger safety and cabin management and maintaining appropriate standards. But the impact is the same. The impact is that an 8-year-old girl who asked for water was grabbed by an adult in a position of authority hard enough to leave bruises on her arm. The impact is that 30 passengers watched it happen, and most of them did nothing until I stood up. The impact is that a child who should have been safe in her seat instead learned that asking for basic human needs can be met with violence if you ask while black. Eleanor's voice didn't rise, didn't show anger or frustration, but carried the kind of quiet authority that came from 5 decades of explaining obvious truths to people who preferred not to see them. And here's what troubles me most: if that child's father hadn't had $12 billion in leverage, this would have been resolved with a voucher and a confidentiality agreement, just like the 17 previous complaints against that flight attendant. The only reason we're having this conversation is because this particular family had the power to demand consequences. The interview clip was shared 23 million times in the first 6 hours after broadcast, with the phrase, "There is no version of us that is acceptable enough," becoming a hashtag that trended in 11 countries as people shared their own stories of being made to feel unwelcome in spaces they had every right to occupy. Meanwhile, in Queens, Brittany Hayes sat in her darkened apartment with the blinds pulled down and her phone turned off, watching the interview on her laptop while news vans parked outside her building and reporters knocked on her door every 30 minutes. The union representative had called her twice, her sister had called her 6 times, and her neighbor had slipped a note under her door warning her that someone from the New York Times was asking questions about her employment history. But it was Eleanor Crawford's words that cut through 18 years of justification and denial, forcing Brittany to confront the reality that she'd grabbed an 8-year-old girl because she'd looked at a black child in first class and automatically assumed she didn't belong there. Not because of any policy violation, not because of any safety concern, but because some part of her had been programmed to see black presence in premium spaces as inherently suspicious. Dr. Sarah Chen had been Zara's pediatrician since birth, and she'd never seen the Williams family under circumstances that had anything to do with trauma counseling rather than routine checkups and vaccination schedules. But Thursday afternoon found her sitting across from an 8-year-old who'd become the center of a national conversation about racism and corporate accountability, trying to help a child process why a stranger had hurt her for asking for water. "Can you show me where it hurts, Zara?" Dr. Chen asked, gently watching, as Zara rolled up her sleeve to reveal the finger-shaped bruises that had darkened overnight into clear evidence of excessive force. "It doesn't hurt anymore," Zara said, which was mostly true. The physical pain had faded, but the confusion remained the kind of damage that happened when a child's understanding of how the world worked got shattered by adult behavior that made no sense. But I keep thinking about why she was so mad at me. Doctor Chen had treated hundreds of children over 15 years of pediatric practice, and she'd learned to recognize the particular kind of processing that happened when kids encountered adult behavior that violated their basic understanding of fairness and safety. "What have your parents told you about that Mama said some people are broken in places you can't see? And Daddy said that sometimes when people are broken, they hurt other people even when those people don't deserve it." Zara swung her legs from the examination table, her voice taking on the serious tone that children used when they were working through concepts that seemed too big for their experience. "But I don't understand what was broken about her that made her not want to give me water." It was the kind of question that had no good answer, because explaining centuries of racial conditioning and implicit bias to an 8-year-old meant acknowledging that the world was more complicated and more unfair than any child should have to understand. Dr. Chen chose honesty over comfort, the way she always did when children asked difficult questions. "Sometimes people learn ideas when they're young that tell them certain people don't belong in certain places," she said carefully. "And sometimes those ideas are so deep inside them that they don't even realize they have them. But that doesn't make it okay when they act on those ideas, especially when they hurt children." Zara considered this with the kind of thoughtful concentration that had always impressed adults who interacted with her. So she hurt me because of ideas in her head that weren't even true. That's exactly right. And that's why your daddy is working so hard to make sure it doesn't happen to other kids. Meanwhile, 3 time zones away in Seattle. Robert Sterling sat in his executive office, staring at resignation letters from 6 board members and financial projections that showed Pacific Airways losing $4 billion in market value in less than 72 hours. The phone calls had started at 6 a.m. with institutional investors asking pointed questions about discrimination liability, continued through the morning with congressional staffers requesting documentation for upcoming hearings, and wouldn't stop ringing with reporters who wanted statements about everything from employee training protocols to executive compensation packages. "Sir," his assistant said through the intercom, "your wife is on line 3. She says it's urgent." Sterling picked up the phone to hear Margaret's voice tight with the kind of controlled emotion that meant she'd been watching news coverage and thinking about their own children. "Robert, I saw the video. I saw that little girl's face when that woman grabbed her arm." "Margaret, I can't really discuss. You're going to fix this." It wasn't a question or a request, but a statement delivered with the authority of someone who'd been married to him for 23 years and knew exactly what kind of man she'd raised 3 children with. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, you're going to make sure this never happens again." Sterling looked out his office window at the Seattle skyline, thinking about his own daughter at 8 years old, remembering her trust in adults to treat her fairly, her assumption that asking for help would be met with kindness rather than violence. "I'm trying, Margaret. But $12 billion I don't care about $12 billion. I care about making sure that when our granddaughters fly somewhere, they don't get grabbed by someone who thinks they don't belong in their own seats." The independent audit of Pacific Airways began on Monday morning with a team of civil rights investigators who'd been given unprecedented access to employee records, training materials, passenger complaint files, and internal communications going back 5 years. What they found in the first week exceeded even Damon Williams' expectations for institutional dysfunction disguised as corporate policy. Dr. Monica Rodriguez, the lead investigator, had conducted civil rights audits for Fortune 500 companies across multiple industries, but she'd never encountered a more sophisticated system of discrimination hidden behind algorithms and performance metrics that made bias profitable while maintaining legal deniability. "It's not just bad training or unconscious prejudice," she explained to her team on Thursday afternoon. "This is deliberate construction of processes that financially reward discriminatory behavior." The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Brittany Hayes' 17 formal complaints hadn't been ignored or mishandled. They'd been processed through a complaint resolution system specifically designed to make filing grievances so difficult and time-consuming that most passengers gave up before reaching any meaningful review. The few complaints that did survive the process were resolved with vouchers, refunds, and confidentiality agreements that prevented patterns from emerging in public records. Even worse was the discovery that crew performance evaluations included metrics for cabin atmosphere management and disruptive passenger mitigation that essentially paid bonuses to employees who kept first-class passengers comfortable by removing or managing passengers who didn't fit demographic expectations. Brittany Hayes had earned $6,000 in performance bonuses over 3 years for excellence in maintaining premium cabin standards, corporate language that meant getting paid extra for discriminating against minority passengers. "This isn't a failure of the system," Dr. Rodriguez told Robert Sterling during their preliminary findings meeting. "This is the system working exactly as designed. Your airline didn't accidentally enable discrimination. You institutionalized it and made it profitable." Sterling sat across the conference table with Thomas Brightwell and their new diversity consultant, listening to evidence that his company had spent years perfecting discrimination while maintaining plausible deniability about discriminatory intent. "How do we fix it?" Complete overhaul. New training protocols developed with civil rights organizations, independent oversight of passenger complaints, elimination of performance metrics that incentivize discrimination, and mandatory bias testing for every employee in passenger-facing roles. Dr. Rodriguez had compiled a 47-page reform plan that would fundamentally restructure how Pacific Airways operated. This isn't cosmetic change. This is rebuilding your corporate culture from the foundation up. Timeline: 6 months for implementation, 2 years for full cultural transformation, ongoing oversight in perpetuity. Dr. Rodriguez closed her folder and looked directly at Sterling. Mr. Sterling, your employee grabbed an 8-year-old child because your company trained her to see black passengers in first class as problems to be managed. If you're not prepared to acknowledge that level of institutional failure, then you're not prepared for the level of change required to fix it. The decision to resign came to Brittany Hayes on a Sunday morning while she sat in her kitchen drinking coffee and staring at a printed copy of Eleanor Crawford's CNN interview reading, for the 10th time, the phrase that had been haunting her for 6 days. There is no version of us that is acceptable enough. She'd spent 18 years believing that her job was to maintain standards, to keep first-class passengers comfortable, to enforce policies that existed for legitimate safety and service reasons. But watching herself on video grab an 8-year-old girl's arm, seeing her own face twisted with anger at a child whose only crime was asking for water, forced her to confront the reality that she'd been enforcing something much darker than airline policies. The resignation letter took her 3 hours to write, not because she couldn't find words, but because she kept trying to soften them to maintain some version of herself that wasn't entirely defined by 8 minutes of documented cruelty toward a child. Every draft sounded like justification or excuse-making or the kind of corporate doublespeak that kept her from seeing her own behavior clearly. The final version was 2 sentences: "I am resigning from Pacific Airways, effective immediately." What I did to Zara Williams was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But resignation wasn't enough because 37 million people had watched her grab a child, and resignation didn't address the question of why someone who'd worked in customer service for nearly 2 decades could look at an 8-year-old asking for water and see a threat requiring physical force. The public statement she posted on her personal social media account was longer and more painful to write because it required her to acknowledge things about herself that she'd spent 45 years avoiding. 6 days ago, I grabbed an 8-year-old black girl by the arm because she asked me for water. I told myself I was enforcing airline policies. I told myself she was in a restricted area. I told myself I was maintaining cabin safety. All of those justifications were lies I used to avoid admitting the truth. I looked at a black child in first class and decided she didn't belong there. The statement continued for 4 paragraphs. Each sentence a deliberate stripping away of the professional and personal defenses that had allowed her to justify discriminatory behavior for 18 years. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't claim that her actions were out of character, didn't try to minimize the impact on a child who'd been hurt by someone in a position of authority. Zara Williams asked for water and I responded with violence. That's the truth, and it's a truth that makes me sick to acknowledge. But acknowledgement is the first step toward understanding how someone becomes the kind of person who hurts children for being thirsty while black. The Senate Commerce Committee hearing room was packed beyond capacity on a Tuesday morning in October with congressional representatives, civil rights advocates, airline industry executives, and media representatives, all gathered to hear testimony about discrimination in commercial aviation and the federal government's role in preventing incidents like what had happened to Zara Williams. Eleanor Crawford sat at the witness table wearing her best blue dress and the expression of dignified determination that had carried her through 5 decades of fighting for civil rights in courtrooms and boardrooms across the country. At 68, with arthritis that made sitting for long periods painful, she'd flown from Detroit to Washington specifically to tell 12 senators exactly what she'd seen in the first-class cabin of Pacific Airways Flight 2847. Senators, I want you to imagine your own 8-year-old granddaughter asking a flight attendant for water and having that request met with physical force. Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. I want you to imagine watching a uniformed authority figure grab your granddaughter's arm hard enough to leave bruises because she'd committed the crime of being thirsty. Senator Patricia Williams of California leaned forward with the kind of focused attention that suggested this wasn't just a policy hearing, but a personal issue for someone whose own grandchildren traveled frequently. Mrs. Crawford, in your observation, was this an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern? Senator, I've been fighting discrimination for 40 years, and I can tell you that what happened to Zara Williams was the predictable result of institutional policies that make racism profitable while maintaining legal deniability. Eleanor had spent the flight to Washington reviewing Dr. Rodriguez's audit findings, and she delivered her testimony with the precision of someone who'd studied the evidence. Pacific Airways had 17 formal complaints about this specific employee's discriminatory behavior, all resolved with vouchers and silence. This wasn't a breakdown of the system. This was the system working as designed. The hearing continued for 6 hours with testimony from Damon Williams about the financial leverage required to force institutional change from Dr. Rodriguez about the audit findings, and from Robert Sterling about the comprehensive reforms Pacific Airways was implementing. But it was Eleanor's closing statement that provided the moral framework for the federal legislation that would emerge from the hearings. The question isn't whether discrimination exists in commercial aviation, Eleanor said, looking directly at the senators who would vote on passenger protection legislation. The question is whether we're going to continue allowing it to exist without consequences. Zara Williams had a father with $12 billion in leverage. Most children don't. If we only protect the children whose parents can threaten to bankrupt airlines, then we're not really protecting children at all. The Passenger Dignity and Safety Act passed the Senate 3 weeks later by a vote of 87-13, establishing federal standards for anti-discrimination training, independent oversight of passenger complaints, and mandatory reporting of discrimination incidents to the Department of Transportation. It was signed into law on a Thursday afternoon, with Zara Williams standing next to the president holding a new sketchbook that contained drawings of airplanes where every passenger was smiling. The American Airlines first-class cabin looked exactly like every other first-class cabin Zara Williams had seen: spacious seats arranged in neat rows, overhead bins for carry-on luggage, passengers settling in for the flight from San Francisco to New York with the casual entitlement that came with premium tickets. But this time something was different from the moment she and her mother stepped into their row. "Welcome aboard the flight attendant," said warmly, kneeling down to Zara's level with a genuine smile. "I'm Jennifer, and I'll be taking care of you today. Is this your first time flying with us?" "No, but it's my first time flying since—" Zara paused, looking up at her mother with the kind of checking for permission expression that children develop when they know their experiences have become part of larger conversations. Keisha nodded encouragingly. "Since a flight attendant grabbed my arm for asking for water." Jennifer's expression shifted immediately to one of professional concern and personal compassion. "I'm so sorry that happened to you. That should never happen to any passenger, especially not to someone your age. Can I bring you some water right now? And maybe some crackers or cookies if you're hungry?" It was such a simple interaction, the kind of basic courtesy that should have been routine for any child traveling in any cabin on any airline. But for Zara, it represented the difference between a world where 8-year-old black girls asking for water were treated as threats and a world where they were treated as customers deserving of respect and service. "Yes, please," Zara said, settling into her seat with the kind of relaxed comfort that suggested the months of therapy and family conversations and gradual rebuilding of trust in airline travel had accomplished what they were supposed to accomplish. "And if you have those little cookies, I really like those." 20 minutes later, Jennifer returned with water in a proper glass rather than a plastic cup, a small plate of cookies and a coloring page featuring the airline's logo that she'd taken the time to find in the galley supplies. "I heard you like to draw," she said, offering Zara a small pack of crayons along with the coloring page. "My daughter is about your age and she's always drawing on flights." Zara accepted the gifts with the kind of delighted surprise that came from being treated as an individual rather than a category, and she spent the next hour alternating between working on the coloring page and adding to her own sketchbook, which now contained drawings of airplanes filled with passengers of every color imaginable, all sitting together, all being served by smiling flight attendants who brought water without being asked twice. Eleanor Crawford, traveling in Seat 2C for her monthly visits to see grandchildren in New York, watched the interaction with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent 6 months working with airlines and congressional committees to make sure this kind of basic courtesy became standard rather than exceptional. The Passenger Dignity Advisory Board that she now chaired had reviewed training protocols for 7 major airlines, ensuring that customer service training included specific modules about unconscious bias and the particular challenges faced by passengers who'd historically been made unwelcome in premium travel spaces. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked Zara during the flight, leaning across the aisle, with the warm familiarity that had developed over months of working together on foundation events and congressional hearings. "Good," Zara replied, looking up from a drawing of an airplane with windows that showed dozens of happy faces inside. "This is how flying is supposed to be, isn't it? Where everyone is nice and brings you water when you ask. This is exactly how flying is supposed to be." Eleanor agreed, thinking about all the children who would travel more safely because one 8-year-old girl had asked for water, and her father had refused to let the subsequent assault be buried with vouchers and silence. The Williams family dinner table on a Thursday evening in March looked the same as it had before Pacific Airways Flight 2847 changed their lives, Damon helping Zara with homework while Keisha finished preparation for tomorrow's Foundation board meeting. Normal family chaos, punctuated by conversations about school projects and weekend plans, and whether they should get a dog like Zara had been requesting for 6 months. But there were differences that spoke to growth rather than just recovery. Zara's confidence had returned stronger than before, built on the knowledge that asking for help was not just acceptable, but encouraged that adults in positions of authority were supposed to respond to children's needs with kindness rather than force. Her artwork had evolved, too filled with images of diverse families traveling together airplanes, where every passenger looked happy, and drawings of herself standing at podiums, speaking to audiences about treating all children with respect. Daddy, Zara said, looking up from her math homework with the kind of serious expression that usually preceded important questions. Mrs. Patterson asked if I wanted to talk to her class about what happened on the airplane, but I don't know if I want to tell that story again. Damon set down his coffee and gave her his full attention, the way he'd learned to do during months of family therapy sessions focused on helping all 3 of them process trauma and transformation. "What would you want to tell them if you decided to do it?" "I want to tell them that asking for help is okay, and that if adults are mean to them when they ask for help, it's not because they did something wrong." Zara's voice carried the kind of wisdom that came from having experienced injustice and watching it be addressed through adult action rather than just adult promises. "And I want to tell them about the foundation and how we help other kids when people are mean to them for no good reason." Keisha looked up from her laptop where she'd been reviewing applications for the Foundation's newest program providing legal support to families who experienced discrimination in transportation settings. In 8 months, they'd assisted over 400 families, documented patterns of discriminatory behavior across multiple industries, and established partnerships with civil rights organizations in 12 states. "What would make you feel good about telling that story?" Keisha asked, using the kind of gentle questioning that helped children process complex decisions without feeling pressured. "If I could tell them about the good parts, too. About how Captain Rodriguez was nice to me, and how Eleanor stood up for me, and how you and Daddy made sure other kids won't get grabbed for asking for water." Zara closed her math book and turned to face both parents. "I don't want to just tell them about the scary part. I want to tell them about how people can fix things when they work together." It was the kind of perspective that had impressed congressional representatives and foundation donors, and everyone who'd met Zara over the past months, this ability to hold both the trauma of what had happened and the hope of what had emerged from it. She'd become, without asking for it, and despite her age, a symbol of resilience and the possibility that individual moments of injustice could become catalysts for broader change. 1 year after Brittany Hayes grabbed Zara Williams' arm in the galley of Pacific Airways Flight 2847, a 7-year-old girl named Maya Rodriguez boarded an American Airlines flight from Phoenix to Atlanta with her grandmother carrying a small backpack and the kind of nervous excitement that came with her first airplane ride. Maya was Black. Her grandmother was worried about potential problems, and both of them remembered the viral video that had changed airline training protocols across the country. But when Maya asked flight attendant Lisa Chen for apple juice during the beverage service, Lisa smiled and brought it immediately along with a small pack of crackers and a friendly question about whether Maya was excited about her trip. When Maya spilled some of the juice on her tray table a few minutes later, Lisa cleaned it up without complaint and brought her a replacement drink without being asked. It was exactly the kind of routine, courteous service that should have been standard for any child on any flight, but which had become possible because 37 million people had watched an 8-year-old get grabbed for asking for water, and enough of them had demanded change to make normal human decency a mandated part of airline employee training. Maya's grandmother, Carmen Rodriguez, had been prepared for potential confrontation based on decades of experiencing discrimination in hotels and restaurants and rental car counters. Instead, she watched her granddaughter receive the same level of service as every other passenger in the cabin, treated as a welcome customer rather than a potential problem. Abuela Maya said settling back in her seat with her juice and crackers flying is fun. "The lady is really nice." Carmen squeezed her granddaughter's hand and thought about Zara Williams, whom she'd never met, but whose family's refusal to accept assault as the price of traveling, while Black had made this ordinary moment of kindness possible. Not just possible, but required, because the Passenger Dignity and Safety Act now mandated exactly this kind of respectful treatment for every passenger, regardless of age or race, or the assumptions that individual employees might make about who belonged in premium seating. In San Francisco, Zara Williams was working on a new drawing at the kitchen table, while her father prepared dinner and her mother reviewed foundation reports showing that discrimination complaints in commercial aviation had dropped by 43% in the past year. The drawing showed an airplane flying over a world where children of every color were traveling safely, where flight attendants brought water with smiles, where families could move through airports without fear that asking for help would be met with hostility. At the bottom of the page, in her careful third-grade handwriting, Zara had written the words that had become the Foundation's unofficial motto: "Every kid deserves water when they're thirsty." It was a simple statement, the kind of obvious truth that shouldn't have required a federal law to protect, but which had become a powerful reminder that justice often began with the smallest acts of human decency extended to the most vulnerable people. Because sometimes change didn't happen through grand gestures or political movements, but through the accumulation of individual moments when children were treated with kindness instead of suspicion, when asking for help was met with assistance instead of force, when the basic dignity that should belong to every person was actually extended to every person, regardless of their age or color or the biases of the adults in positions of authority over them. 3 months later, Brittany Hayes completed her certification as a social worker and began working at a community center in Queens, where her job involved helping families navigate discrimination in housing, employment, and education. She never worked in aviation again, but she carried with her the memory of 8-year-old Zara Williams asking for water, and she made sure that every child who came through the community center doors was treated with the respect and kindness she should have shown that day at 30,000 feet. Pacific Airways became the industry leader in anti-discrimination training and passenger advocacy, with Robert Sterling frequently speaking at conferences about the importance of treating every passenger as a valued customer regardless of assumptions about their background. The company's stock price eventually recovered and exceeded its pre-incident levels, proving that doing the right thing was not only morally necessary, but financially sustainable. And every month, Zara Williams received letters from children around the world who'd heard her story and wanted to share their own experiences of being treated unfairly by adults in authority positions. Letters that she answered with drawings of airplanes, where everyone was welcome, and reminders that asking for help was never wrong, no matter what anyone else might tell them. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who believes that children deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter where they travel or what they look like. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever witnessed discrimination that could have been prevented if more people had chosen to stand up like Eleanor Crawford did. Together we can build a world where every child gets water when they ask for it.